So this is fun. I got to review a video game. For some background, I had a short stint in video game journalism about 3 years ago, and while my time there was short, I got to do a lot of cool things. I got to review games, go to events, and preview upcoming games. One of those games I got to preview is called Lost Words Beyond the Page. I previewed it back in 2018, 2019. I wrote a whole piece on it. I'll probably link it below this. I didn't read it. I don't usually reread my things. And while I kind of moved on to a new chapter of my life, the developers of that game were kind enough to remember my preview. In fact, the leader of the game contacted me and asked if I wanted to code for the game, and of course I said yes. So thanks to Mark Backler and everyone at Sketchbook Games, The Fourth Estate, Modus Games, Tinsley PR for this code. Lost Words Beyond the Page is described as an atmospheric puzzle platformer, and it is developed by Sketchbook Games and The Fourth Estate and published by Modus Games. It's a story-focused game, and while there are some platforming and puzzle-solving elements, the focus here is on telling a narrative. But Lost Words is unique in that it tells a story within a story. The main overarching story centers around a girl named Izzy, but you actually don't directly control Izzy ever in the game, but rather you play as a representation of her in her journal, and you also explore the fantasy world that she has created as part of the story she is currently writing. Something that's really cool is that you actually get to influence this story that Izzy is creating. Nothing with like major story implications like Mass Effect, but some cool subtle things that I really appreciated. Things like her name, dress color, and even the personalities of some characters. And while the fantasy stuff is the more substantial part of the game in terms of content, the emotional core is obviously Izzy. You start off this game by learning that Izzy's grandmother, whom she is very close to, has gifted her with a journal. It's not much of a spoiler to say that things quickly take a turn for the sad. Grief is a major theme of this game, and I'll touch on that in a bit, but it's also a story about how the events of our life shape the things we create and put out into the world, and how our imaginations allow us to escape reality to an extent. So before we start a new chapter within the fantasy story, you play a short segment within Izzy's journal. And I love the art style of these sections. It's 2D, black and white in a way that I would describe as a more mature and fluid Diary of a Wimpy Kid. But there's also a splash of watercolor within. It really helps it stand out visually. This game overall is a platformer, but the journal sections has much more pronounced platforming. In this part of the game, the words are used as platforms, and sometimes words are highlighted in like blue or purple, and landing on them causes things to happen within the journal. There's also some puzzle solving in this section, mainly involving words or pictures that have been obviously cut out. And sometimes this puzzle solving involves forming a sentence, or sometimes you can grab onto a picture to cause other things to happen within the journal. I don't know if I'm describing this really well, so here's some gameplay showing off this. I honestly really appreciated how creatively the team incorporated the puzzles of this section. It never strayed outside of being a journal, but it also stretched the confines of what you would expect from playing a game that's set within a journal. Unfortunately, the platforming isn't the tightest in this game, which isn't necessarily surprising because this isn't the focus of the game. And it is pretty generous with its platforming. There were a few times where I was dangerously close to the edge of a platform that I still made the landing. I was still propped up. Like I said, the focus of this section of the game isn't the platforming per se, it is the narration that Izzy is telling about the events of her life, and it was genuinely moving for me. You're never engaging with the story directly, but rather you're learning about it after the fact, which I found to be a really clever way of telling a story. While this does form the bulk of the game's emotional core, they really are interludes for the fantasy sections of the game, which personally was my favorite part. I'd actually describe this section of the game just like a Disney movie. All the tropes are there. You start off as the apprentice of a village elder before graduating to become the guardian itself. And right as that happens, her village is attacked and the sacred fireflies that protect her village are taken. I may be subtle about it, but I love Disney movies, so that was really exciting for me. She starts off in a relatively restricted environment before something world-shattering happens and forces her to leave the confines of the world she's known. And on this adventure, she meets friends, overcomes obstacles, and faces debilitating self-doubt before ultimately triumphing. Spoilers, I guess. She even gets an animal sidekick that has gameplay functionality. And I'll get to that in a second, don't worry. And I really like the world this story is set in. It's so bright and vibrant, and even though it has a 2.5D look, which I'm not normally a fan of in games, it had this cel-shaded look that really made me appreciate it more than I normally may have. I don't want to get into spoilers since the narrative is such a heavy focus, but I was really affected by this story as well. While I was able to clock a lot of the twists, it didn't really make it less impactful for me. and you can really tell the effect Izzy's mental state is having on the story she's trying to tell. And I like how the characters you meet in this story, like I said, it's like a Disney movie, and the music is really good overall in this game. While the fantasy sections has a more orchestral sweeping score, the journal sections has much more of a minimalist piano driven, which really was tonally appropriate, I felt. While navigating the fantasy world, you and the hero have access to a spellbook of words, and you can use these words as spells in the world itself. These words are learned as the story progresses and are stored in the book that you just pull up with a trigger. Some spells last the whole game once you get them, while others are only temporary. These word spells operate similarly to the puzzles in the journal. You select the word from the book, pull it out into the world, and use it on a specific object. So for example, you can use rise to raise a platform, or break to break down a wall, so on and so forth. While some of the spells are implemented in some pretty basic ways, some of them are used in ways I found really clever. Again, without getting the spoilers, a late section of the game incorporated the rise spell in a way that I really found cool, and I didn't know what to do in this section of the game, and once it clicked, I was like, oh wow, that's really clever and cool. You move these spells with the right joystick, aka the Firefly. See, I told you it had gameplay functionality. And while I found it overwhelming at first for some reason, it became a lot less so once I realized you didn't actually have to hold the trigger down when you selected a word. That was just a me problem. The game's not particularly hard, and anytime I did find myself stuck, I was able to solve the problem in like a few minutes. You also don't really die in this game. If you do happen to fall off a platform, you're immediately respawned. Not always in the exact spot you fell, but close enough where it's not really that much of a handicap. Definitely isn't a super challenging game, but if you're playing this game, I'm expecting you're not really looking for a challenge out of it anyway. This is clearly designed to tell a specific narrative, and while I did liken it to a Disney movie, there are some interactive elements like the spell casting that obviously make it firmly a game. The game ran really well. I didn't have any performance issues. The one notable glitch for me was 2 instances where the music just cut out, and not like the biggest deal breaker, but it did a lot to really take me out of the experience, unfortunately. So now time to talk about the heavy stuff. Obviously, this is a story about grief, which is unfortunately one of those universal emotions that everyone will experience sometime in their life. And as someone who has experienced the death of a grandparent, this game hit particularly close to home. Unfortunately, we're in a time where grief is more present in our everyday lives than it ever has been. I don't want to necessarily dissuade you from playing it because I do think it tells an impactful story. I just feel like it's something that you should be aware of before you play this game. Because it is a story about grief, but it's also a story about how grief is something you keep with you and it becomes a part of you. It's not always going to be at the forefront of your life, but you're always going to carry it with you for the rest of your life. And whether we know it or not, it does have an impact on how we live our lives. And if you're a creative person who makes creative works, it's going to have an undeniable impact. It's just natural for us to draw on our life experiences anytime we create something, and it doesn't have to be at the forefront of that work for it to have an impact. Yes, I did get teary-eyed at the end of this. I'm not really one to be emotional while playing a game, but this one got me, probably because, like I said, it hit really close to home. Lost Words is going to be available on basically every platform. PS4, where I played it, Xbox One, Switch, and PC. It's a pretty short game. I think I clocked in at about like 4 hours. So if a fan of like just short narrative-driven games with minimal challenge that will still make you do something, it's definitely not a walking simulator. I definitely recommend it. Just prepare to get emotional and be ready. And you can't even get a PS5 anyway, so just play this. It's worth it.